All right, hello. This is John Miller from your 1230 to 150 class, and this is my final project on Motown. Motown started with the creator Berry Gordy Jr. Berry Gordy became interested in music after returning home from the Korean War. Whenever he came home, he decided to invest all the money that he had into creating a record store, but the store only really survived for about 2 or 3 years, and then it went under. But after he sold the store, he met a singer named Jackie Wilson, and he became a songwriter for his band or for him for about 2 years. And then he met Smokey Robinson, who was another famous singer around the area, who eventually became even more famous because of Motown. But he also became a songwriter for Smokey Robinson for a while. He used to sell singles to different studios for Smokey Robinson. Um, and eventually it got to the point where Gordy bought a house in Detroit, which eventually turned into the very first Hitsville, USA, in Detroit. So before we get into the bands, I felt like we should probably define on what is Motown. Motown, the actual name of itself, comes from combining motor and town, because it was based out of Detroit, which was famous for a bunch of car manufacturers in the area, like Ford and Chevrolet at the time. Um, it is typically described as a blend of soul music and pop music, and it was around from, or this style of Motown was around from the 60s to like the 70s. Between 1960 and 1969, 79 top 100 songs were from the Motown label. And later the Motown label, or the Motown recording label, moved to Los Angeles due to an interest in moving into movies and television shows for their various acts that they had. So the very first successful band under Tamla Records was the Miracles, which had Smokey Robinson in it, who was one of the guys who helped Berry Gordy eventually become the director of Motown. Something also that's important to mention here is Tamla Records was the very first recording studio that Berry Gordy had created, but it later became Motown Records after it combined with another record label, which I could not find the name of. But anyways, so the Miracles. The band had 6 members. They had Barry Rogers, Marv Tarplin, Ronald White, Claudette Robinson, Smokey Robinson, and Pete Moore. Their very first song, or their very first hit song, was called "Bad Girl." It reached the top 100 in America and did well overseas, which was a big deal. They had several hit songs in the United States, and they were the first Motown group to sell a million copies with "Who's Loving You." Something that I thought was pretty cool was that the Beatles, the Who, and the Zombies all credit them for being inspirations for their own music later on. So I think this group is probably the most famous, or at least one of the most famous. These were the Supremes. The Supremes were the most commercially successful group from Motown. They had 12 hit singles on the top 100 in the 60s. The band was made up of Diana Ross, Florence Ballard, and Mary Wilson. The most popular songs are "Where Do Our Love Go," "Baby Love," "Stop in the Name of Love," and "Back in My Arms Again." Um, Whenever they were producing music, they rivaled the Beatles, and many critics claim that they were the reason why Motown did better or Motown did well in the future, and why other black artists were also able to enter into mainstream music. Diana Ross later went on to do her own solo projects, and she would go and record with other studios. But most of the time that she was at Motown, she was like kind of the face of Motown, as we'll talk about later on. Another famous artist was Marvin Gaye. Um, he was also he. So whenever he first joined Motown, he was signed on after he did a private performance, where Berry Gordy found him, and he struggled to get into the top 100 for a few years on his own. But he would play like the drums, or he would play the guitar, or he would do some vocals on some other band stuff. Like I think he played the drums mainly for the Miracles, I think he did a couple of samples of guitars for the Supremes. But he eventually ended up becoming one of Motown's most famous uh, producers because of his vocals and his songwriting. Once they let up on the creative process a bit in the '70s, his famous songs are "I Heard It Through the Grapevine," "Let's Get It On," and "Ain't No Mountain High Enough." So these So this band was what I was meaning whenever I said I wanted to talk about Diana Ross later, because the Jackson Five were fairly interesting because they started out almost from the get go as trying to be commercially sellable, um, and so the Jackson Five was made up of Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, and then Marlon and Michael all joined later, but they were all brothers. Um, they So whenever they first tried out for Motown, they were turned away. Um, but then they went to a different studio and they had a little bit of moderate they had a little bit of moderate success, and Barry Gordy decided to sign them on after, because I don't think he was not involved in the process of their first audition. So whenever they first picked them up, they decided that they were going to have Diana Ross. Um, the story was going to go that Diana Ross was the one who found them and brought them to Motown. But as a result, as well, because they had the signal boost of having Diana Ross apparently behind them, they had five. No, sorry, they had two number one singles on the top 100 before they had even released an album. And then their first album, Diana Ross Presents the Jackson Five. That's the album cover that I have there. Um, that was their very first album, and that even had three more singles. So they had five top 100 singles in the very first year that they were established. Their famous songs are "I Want You Back," "ABC," "The Love You Save," and "I'll Be There." Stevie Wonder is pretty interesting because he's been around. He was around the Motown label pretty close to whenever it started, but he didn't really come into his own or really be able to. He wasn't really creatively allowed to have his own control until the '70s. So he actually joined when he was 11 years old. Um, People called him a child prodigy at playing the piano, and so what he did for the most part was he played piano parts on the background of a lot of different artists' songs. Um, he had a mentor for his first part of him being in from I think 1961 to about 1967. He had a Stevie Robinson or Smokey Robinson, sorry, um, was his mentor and helped him write and helped him record for Motown. But about the same time that Marvin Gaye was allowed more creative control over his projects, Stevie Wonder was as well, and he was the very first person to incorporate synthesizer into the R&B sound that he had kind of started carving out for himself. Um, his famous songs are "Fingertips," "Superstition," and "Signed, Sealed, Delivered, I'm Yours." Um, he is very much considered a pioneer of R&B music due to incorporating the synthesizer and really popularizing it in the '70s. Eventually, Motown decided to move to Los Angeles from Detroit. Um, there were a couple of reasons for this. One thing that I saw that was cited, but I couldn't find anybody saying, I couldn't find Barry Gordy saying directly, was that the Detroit riots of 1972 that contributed to it. But as far as everyone else's official standpoints go, it was so that they could move into making movies and into making television shows. For example, the Jackson Five had a movie called Going Back to Illinois, and Diana Ross had her own show, and she showed up in a bunch of different shows. And then there was a couple of movies that came out that had like Marvin Gaye and the Jackson Five in it and stuff like that. And they were mildly successful, I believe. Um, One of the biggest points of them moving to Los Angeles was after three of the major writers at Motown, um, the people who had written for the Supremes, the Miracles, some of Marvin Gaye's early stuff, a little bit of Stevie Wonder stuff, and they had all had a dispute over how much they were earning in royalties because I believe they were earning about 2% of the royalties for their songs that they had written. And whenever they left, that's what sparked the lessening of creative control, or the allowing the artist to have greater creative control over their own music. Um, like I said, Marvin Gaye and Stevie Wonder were the two who really had a lot of success with their control over how much they performed or what they performed and what they wrote.